What's up, everybody? Welcome back to U.S. History. All right, now this is a really important chunk of notes that I'm going to try to keep pretty brief, but it's definitely going to affect and tie into, I would say about half of the lessons that we have left this year. Really, there's two things we're going to be kind of looking at: the Cold War and then the Civil Rights Unit, or the Civil Rights Movement, I should say. All of the things that are the Cold War are going to kind of sort of link back into communism in some way, shape, or form. Now, communism is a term that has been around for quite a long time. I think it's absolutely still relevant today. And I'll say, your average Joe Schmo on the street, I don't care if they're young, if they're a teenager, or if they're an older adult my age, really doesn't usually have a very good understanding of what communism is. And it's one of those things that it's like it gets thrown around enough in like the media or just in life. This term does get used quite a bit still. That I think it's beneficial to you to have a pretty good working definition and understanding of what communism is and what it means, and kind of a quick understanding of the origins of it. Because like I said, a lot of people they kind of lack that. They'll throw this term around willy-nilly. You'll hear like politicians call other politicians communists. This kind of frustrates me on both sides, where it's like, one side of the political spectrum says all their political enemies are like fascists, like Hitler is. And the other side says, oh, you're all a bunch of communists like Stalin. And anybody that throws those terms around and seriously is trying to talk about American politicians of modern day doesn't know that much about history. Because, man, a lot of the fascists from a couple generations ago and the communists are really, really rotten dudes. And I don't think I see any politicians in America today that quite fit into that mold. So let's dig into it a little bit. I would say, too, one last thing before we get going. This is going to tie into the Cold War notes. Now, you can absolutely just throw this on your page of Cold War notes that's going already. But because this is such an overarching thing, like most of the stuff I cover in lecture videos, you're probably not going to apply to the real world a whole lot. It'll make you a more well-rounded person. You'll have a better understanding of American history. But unless you get into like being an American history teacher or working at a museum or something, you're probably not going to apply it in your day-to-day life. This term, like a vocab term like this that I'm tying in, I think you will actually be able to apply this and use this term more correctly, I guess, down the road in your life. So I would say, I think if it was me, I would start a fresh new page up and just enter this stuff there, because then anytime you are looking or reviewing any of your notes from the Cold War era, and honestly, some of the stuff from the Civil Rights Movement notes, a lot of that will link back into this. So it might be a good idea to have it in its own separate spot on its own separate page, put a big bold heading up there like Communism Explained or something like that. Okay, now I want to give you a good definition. I want to give you a quick rundown of the history of it, and then I want to talk kind of like philosophy and practicality of how it is applied, and why it's kind of an interesting philosophy, yet also it has some major flaws. Okay, so that's what we're getting into here. First up, the kind of Taluki definition of communism. You could probably look up on Google or go check out a dictionary or something and find slightly different definitions to it. But this is kind of the definition that I would want you to have for my class. So communism it's a system which advocates class warfare. That's a very big thing in it, that there are different social classes. You have like the proletariat down at the bottom, which is like the working class, where they own essentially nothing. The only thing they have of value is their labor. You know, the farmers, the industrial workers, that group, the working class laborers. Okay, so it's a system which advocates class warfare, and where all of the land, and maybe a better way of saying it would be means of production, but land and production. So think like agriculture and factory workers, is going to be publicly owned. Okay. And when you say publicly owned, that means the government is going to come in and manage it, and is going to ideally manage it in such a way that it's going to benefit the working class and everybody will gain. So like you get what's happening here in a system that is a truly purely ideological communist system, you have no ruling class. You don't have any kings, any czars or emperors. You don't have like aristocracy, like the noblemen. You don't have super wealthy like businessmen or anything like that. Now, does that work in practice? Or do we kind of, I guess, the way the world runs today, we kind of sort of need leaders, don't we? You need like some sort of a hierarchy, to actually practically make a system function. So it's like kind of the definition of it is you want the workers to control everything. The proletariat, this working class, everything is going to be managed on their behalf. And ideally, they're like all equal and they're going to co-equally share the profits of everybody's labor. But in reality, to like actually make a system like this function, you do need some sort of a hierarchy. So right there is a kind of an initial problem with it, with the whole setup. Now, another big thing about communism is it seeks like equal outcomes for all. It doesn't necessarily mean 100% of the time everybody makes exactly the same, but in general, most people are going to basically get all the same stuff. No matter how hard you work or what talents you may have, it's looking for equal outcomes for everybody. We're all treated the same. So like, it can be made to sound really good in theory, but in practice, often it's not very practical and doesn't lead to the best outcomes. But that's what it's trying to do or accomplish there. All right, now a little bit of the history. I don't want to get into this super deep. It's something that probably Mr. V will cover more in world history. It is kind of fascinating to learn the whole history of communism. Now, it was originally like coined by German philosopher Karl Marx back in like, I don't know, kind of the Civil War era. I want to say it was like the 1860s, 1870s, but might not be totally spot on in that. But it was for sure in the 1800s where Marx and this other guy, Engels, wrote the Communist Manifesto. Their ideas start to take hold a little bit and get spread around. But back at that time, pre-World War I, all of the old regimes, the old monarchies in Europe are way too strong for communism to take hold. But then once you move on ahead to World War I and all the chaos that creates, that's when you finally see communism take hold. And kind of ironically, it does not first take hold in Germany, where Marx was from. It takes off in Germany's arch enemy, Russia. That's when you have the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. In this German philosophy from a generation before takes hold in Russia, which then becomes the Soviet Union. Okay, so some quick rundown there. And remember another kind of key term for you that occasionally you might hear this get thrown around, but the proletariat, that's talking about the working class. That's Marx's terms where he uses that a lot, and I've seen where kids get confused if they're reading an excerpt about communism. But if you hear the proletariat, think of like laborers, workers, the farmers, the industrial workers. Okay. Now some examples, and we're going to talk about these different countries throughout Q4. We obviously have already hit Russia, which is AKA the Soviet Union. So in World War I, when the Bolshevik Revolution happens, it's no longer Russia. Now it's the Soviet Union or the USSR. The United Soviet Socialist Republics. All right. Then communism or the Soviet government collapses in the early 1990s, and then it goes back to being Russia, essentially. It actually kind of broke up, but we'll get into that stuff more down the road. Now, for a while, really kind of from like World War I on through to World War II, Russia is like the only communist country in the world. But the British, the Americans, a lot of other countries are keeping a close eye on them. Remember, we work with the Russians through World War II because the Nazis we saw as like we perceived them as the biggest threat, and the Russians or the Soviets felt the same way. But as soon as that common enemy is defeated, we go right back to squaring off with them, and we don't trust the Russians or the Soviets. They don't trust us much. Both sides are trying to spread their own ideology. So like after World War II, America is now a superpower, and we kind of take the leadership role in protecting and kind of promoting democracies around the world. Already talked about that a little bit. Well, the Soviet Union, of course, is going to be the other superpower out there, and they're going to try to go spread their philosophy and ideology, which is communism. The first place it kind of hold at least the first big notable country that I want to mention is China. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, and I think this totally has had echoes throughout the history where this is becoming more and more relevant day by day that China went communist, because now I would argue that today, modern day in the 2020s, the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore, but Russia, is no longer like America's biggest threat out there. Although sometimes maybe it gets spun that way in the news, but really the other big superpower on the planet Earth today is China, and it's still a communist system. And increasingly, I think it feels like America and China are engaging in a cold war with each other. Okay, so I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but we're going to cover like China going communist back in history. We'll talk about that a little bit and what that meant, and then how over time that's become more and more important. It totally ties into current events. The next little war we're going to hit, which actually I'm going to do some civil rights stuff before we get to it, but we are going to talk about the Korean War, and then of course North Korea is still infamously a communist country today that now has nuclear weapons. So that can kind of be bridged into current events too. But the Korean War is coming up in the near future. Now, the one that was a little bit close to home was Cuba. That's an island about 90 miles south of Florida. When Cuba goes communist, that really shakes America because it's right in our backyard. But we'll talk about that. Now, Cuba is starting to change a little bit today. But still, essentially, they are a communist country and have been since about the 1950s. Then the Vietnam War that we're going to get and cover in a pretty big way. Vietnam is another communist nation that, we were trying to stop the spread of communism there, are not successful in that war. And then eventually when America leaves, the whole country ends up getting reunified and becoming communist. So this is stuff that's on the docket. This is a lot of the big Cold War topics that we're going to be hitting over the next couple months here. So hopefully you find that stuff interesting. Now, the last thing I want to leave you with is like communism, kind of the theory versus the reality of it. I think ideologically, communism sounds like a beautiful philosophy in a lot of ways, that everybody's going to be equal. We aren't going to have any kings. We're not going to have any social classes. We're going to treat everybody the same, and everybody's going to get the same outcomes. It kind of sort of sounds good. You can make it spun in a very appealing way. The problem is wherever it's been applied up to this point in history, it's had pretty much disastrous outcomes. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. I would love to debate anybody that says there's been a lot of success with communist countries. That's just not the case. Now, one of the big flaws is like that. How do things work on a macro or a large scale? I would argue, and this is kind of a Tuluki, like subjective or my biased opinion, that communism actually works fantastically on a very small micro scale. But once you try to scale it up, it totally goes off the rails and does not work. And you essentially end up getting a system where there's propaganda and like the people are told, hey, we're managing everything together. We're on a team. We're going to be getting the same stuff. But in reality, when you step back and look at it, you're going to have like some basically dictator or a small group of cronies that are going to be running the whole country. And of course, they're going to be super wealthy and they're going to be really hooked up with everything and they're going to hook up their friends. But all the rest of you little cretins kind of, you just get in line and wait your turn, which, man, that sounds an awful lot like old school, like monarchies where there was a king and all the other little peasants did what they were told. You know what I mean? It's like that. It was designed to get rid of that system. In reality, it just kind of restructures it and shapes it again and repackages it in a different way. So a big part of the macro issue is, you guys ever heard of the Dunbar number? I'm guessing most of you have not, but there is some research that's been done on essentially the human brain and our memory capacity. And there's a bunch of different Dunbar numbers, but the important one that we're going to focus on right here is, and you could write that in there, Dunbar number, is that the human brain can essentially remember or maintain about 150 close relationships at any given time. So you can know more people than that. You could know thousands of people. You can have a lot of acquaintances. But like for people that you really, really know, and you can go have an in-depth, meaningful conversation with them. You're going to know quite a bit about them. They're going to know a lot about you. about 150 is the limit to what the human brain can maintain and like keep track of. Once you start going over that number, you could introduce new people, but now your brain's going to start forgetting some of those other people. Kind of a key important number, because all of the anthropological data suggests that back before agriculture, before we had modern societies, and I'm talking like what, maybe over 5,000, maybe 10,000, 15,000 years ago, it appears that humans evolved in groups of 150 or less. Kind of a key number there. We can see the same thing with chimpanzees, but chimpanzees don't have quite the same mental capacity as us. Their Dunbar number for a large group is about 80. So when you see a troop of chimpanzees, and they can be up to 80 in a troop, but once you start crossing that number, either a lot of fighting breaks out and it's chaos, or they split into two smaller troops. The same seems to be true for humans, that, back in our hunter-gatherer tribal days, probably most tribes, there might have been a coalition of tribes and other people that are kind of like you, but within your unit, there was probably about 150 or less people. You can keep track of that many people, and guess what? Communism, where we're all going to share everything, we're all going to pool resources, we're all working together, and we're all getting the same amount of stuff, that works really good when you have 150 or less people. So like something I've often said, and I've heard others say this too, that in my home life, in my family's life, I'm a communist. But when I think about like America at large, I'm totally like a capitalist. I think that system works way better on the macro scale. All right. We can get into that more down the road, but think about that. Like, let me give you a hypothetical scenario to maybe illustrate my point here. Let's say you're in a tribe of 150 people, and your buddy, I don't know, pick some first name that pops into your head, is kind of a slacker, and they don't really want to pull their own weight. Now, when it's dinner time at night, they're the first one up at the fireplace, and they're chowing down and eating their food. But the next day, when it's time to go hunting, they're hanging out down at the river. They're, over there watching squirrels or something like that. That's going to irk you. And that's going to really bother you and the other people in the tribe. And if you can all keep track of each other, you know when somebody's slacking. So what's going to happen to your slacker buddy down the road? I would be willing to bet in most tribal societies, one of two things is going to go down. You're going to have an intervention with them, have a come to Jesus talk. And you know what? That might really wake him up and rattle him. And then he's going to pick up the slack and start working hard. Or option two is, maybe you had a come to Jesus talk with him and he didn't want to hear it, and he keeps slacking and he keeps eating just as much food as he always did. Well, then, and they actually have found some like artifacts and stuff that seem to back this up. You're probably going to give him an arrow in the back and get rid of him. Okay. Because in a tribe of 150 or less people, it's real easy for everybody to keep track of everybody. Everybody knows everybody. So for you to all kind of share everything in a community pot, it works pretty good because you know everybody else and you know who's working hard, who's slacking, and who's not. And I guess most human beings, if they are in a group that size and they know they're being watched, you want to pull your own weight. You want to be a go-getter and you want to help out the whole tribe, okay? You might feel that way with your family or an inner circle of friends. Like, you want to do good things. You want to give them good news. You want to hook them up because they're your people, okay? So communism works great at that small level. But then once you get past 150 people, which every modern country is way more than 150 people, you can't track that many people. So when somebody starts to slack, but yet they still want to get the same paycheck, they still want the same size house that you get, doesn't work so good, does it? There's no incentive to work hard and to be ambitious and go the extra mile at that large scale. If everybody's just going to get the same no matter what, now there's a big incentive for slacking off and not being productive or efficient. And that's kind of the flaw in modern communist countries, that they haven't found a way to compensate for that. That when you do it at the large scale, they're just not as productive as a capitalist country like America would be, because in America, we have a capitalist system that we're going to talk more about that down the road. But but you can be successful because you're smart or you're a hard worker. And by going that extra mile, you can probably get ahead, and you're going to get more than the guy next to you, because that's kind of how a capitalistic or like free market system works. The harder you work, ideally, the more you make. And if you're slacking off, well, you're going to have bad outcomes, and you're not going to be making that much. Okay, hopefully that all made sense. If you have questions about any of this, hit me up, and I'll clarify a little bit better and go more thoroughly explain for you. Take care.